It was a regular evening at the bustling downtown restaurant. The room was filled with the clinking of plates, soft chatter, and the sound of glasses being filled. A tall man, dressed in a casual yet stylish outfit, sat alone at a table near the back. His name was James Carter, a 35-year-old professional boxer who had been in the sport for over a decade. With a muscular build, strong shoulders, and a focused look in his eyes, James was a force to be reckoned with in the ring. But outside of it, he was just another man trying to enjoy a quiet meal after a long day. Unfortunately, that quiet evening would not last. A group of 3 men, clearly drunk, entered the restaurant. They laughed loudly, not caring for anyone around them. They were seated at a table near James. At first, he didn't pay them much attention, enjoying his meal and the peace. But then, one of the men, a big guy with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap, started staring at James. It was the kind of stare that made you feel uncomfortable, as though he was sizing you up for something. James ignored him at first, but then the man spoke. "Hey, you." "Yeah, you," the man slurred, pointing directly at James. "What are you doing here, fatties?" James, taken aback, looked up. He was used to people being rude, but this was different. The group of men laughed loudly at their friend's comment, clearly enjoying the attention. James, being the bigger person, decided not to engage. But the man wasn't done. "What, are you gonna cry, fatty?" he taunted, his voice growing louder. "Go back to where you came from." The word stung, and for a moment, James felt a rush of anger, but he held his ground. He could feel his fists clenching under the table, but he didn't move. He wasn't the type of man to start trouble, especially in a public place. But the man wasn't backing down. He stood up, stumbling slightly as he made his way toward James's table. "You think you can just sit there, huh? Well, I think it's time we teach you a lesson," the man sneered. The entire restaurant seemed to quiet down, all eyes on James and the group of rowdy men. The tension in the air was thick, like something was about to happen. James's mind raced. Should he leave? Should he defend himself? He knew he could handle himself easily, but he didn't want to cause a scene. But before he could decide, the man shoved James's chair back with one swift move, knocking it to the ground. The force of the push made James's heart skip a beat. At that moment, everything changed. James stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing. He was a trained fighter, but he wasn't looking for a fight. Still, this man had crossed a line. James took a step toward him, his broad chest pushing out, his fists at the ready. The group of men went silent for a moment, realizing they might have bitten off more than they could chew. But then the man laughed. "You really think you can take me down, huh? You're just a big, fat joke." James didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting. The man took a swing at James, but it was slow and sloppy, the kind of punch you'd expect from someone who was drunk. In a split second, James ducked and dodged the punch, his years of training kicking in. But before he could strike back, another of the men reached for a chair, lifting it as if he was going to swing it at James. What happened next shocked everyone in the restaurant. James had spent most of his life training his body and mind for moments just like this, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to unfold. The chair came down hard, but just before it made contact, a sound like thunder rang through the room. James had blocked it with his arm, the sheer force of his body knocking the man back with a violent thud. The restaurant went eerily quiet, the energy in the room shifting to something intense, something that had everyone holding their breath. But there was something else that nobody had expected. The moment James's arm hit the man, his phone buzzed with a call. The noise of the ring sliced through the tension in the room, but it was the last thing anyone cared about. No one could take their eyes off what was happening. Was James going to end this now? What would happen next? As the chair fell to the floor with a loud crash, a few people in the restaurant gasped. The group of men were stunned, but James wasn't finished. His fists clenched, his face twisted in a mix of anger and confusion. What was it that had made these men so reckless? What made them think they could get away with this kind of behavior? The man who had originally taunted James stepped back, eyes wide with disbelief. The look of surprise on his face was so clear it almost looked like he was seeing a ghost. James's calm, unwavering demeanor had completely thrown him off. But just as things seemed like they would settle, the man pulled out a knife. A cold, glinting blade appeared in his hand, reflecting the dim light of the restaurant. The room fell into an even deeper silence. No one had expected this. "Get back," the man spat, waving the knife in the air, his hands trembling. "I'll finish what I started." It was a dangerous move. Everyone knew the situation had escalated far beyond what was necessary. James's heart raced. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the best of him now. If he attacked, he might end up facing far more than just a fight. The man was desperate, and desperation often led to rash decisions. With the knife now in the air, it was clear things were about to get very dangerous. James's eyes never left the knife. The man's hand was shaking, but the weapon was still a threat. James could feel his pulse quicken, every muscle in his body tense. He wasn't afraid, he was calculating, thinking about how to get out of this situation without anyone getting hurt. The last thing he wanted was to hurt someone, especially in a public space. But there was no denying the danger. The man's friends stood frozen behind him, unsure whether to step in or back away. They had never expected things to go this far. The air in the restaurant felt thick, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what James would do. "Put the knife down, man," James said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't the way." The man sneered, his grip tightening on the handle. "You think I'm scared of you? You think you can intimidate me just because you're some big guy in a restaurant? You're nothing." James's mind raced. He knew the risks. One wrong move, and the man could strike. But he wasn't about to back down. He had faced far worse in the ring, and now it was about making sure this didn't escalate. He didn't want to hurt the man, but if it came down to it, he would defend himself. The sound of the man's shaky voice cut through the silence again. "You think you're tough, huh? You think I'm scared of you? I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget." James's eyes flicked to the door. There was a small window of opportunity. If he could just move fast enough, he might be able to disarm the man before anyone got seriously hurt. He could feel the muscles in his legs coiling like springs, ready to explode into action. But the man was already making his move. He lunged forward, the knife aimed straight at James's chest. The move was sloppy, driven by panic rather than skill. James ducked just in time, feeling the cold air rush by his face as the blade missed him by mere inches. In that instant, he saw his chance. With a swift motion, James grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it hard, forcing the knife out of his hand. The blade clattered to the floor, sliding across the room. The man yelped in pain, his other hand reaching for James's throat, but James was too fast. With one powerful shove, he knocked the man backward, sending him crashing into a nearby table. The restaurant was in chaos. Some people screamed, others scrambled to their feet, trying to move away from the danger. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the scene, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear, James had the situation under control. The man stumbled, trying to get back on his feet, but James stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Stay down. You don't want to make this worse." The man glared at James, but there was fear in his eyes now. The knife was gone, and he had no backup.
He was outmatched.
The man's friends, still standing at the back of the room, looked at each other nervously, unsure of whether to intervene. But no one moved. The fight was over, and they knew it. For a moment, James stood there, watching the man. His heart was still racing, but his body had settled into a stance of readiness, just in case the situation turned again. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he would do whatever it took to protect himself. But as the man continued to glare at him, James felt something shift in the air. It wasn't just the tension. Something else was going on. The restaurant's owner, a middle-aged woman with short, dark hair, was walking toward them. She looked furious, her hands trembling at her sides. "Is this what you do in my restaurant?" she shouted, her voice thick with anger. "You bring knives into my place? You threaten people in my restaurant? You think this is acceptable?" Her words hit like a slap. James felt his stomach turn. This wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about the entire situation being blown out of proportion. The tension in the room was suffocating, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The owner's gaze shifted to the man who had caused the trouble. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice cold. "This is over. Get out of here, all of you."
Now.
For a moment, it seemed like the group might try to argue. But when the owner reached for her phone, they backed off. The man who had started everything was still nursing his bruised wrist, but he didn't speak. His friends glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. James stood still, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The restaurant owner's words had given him a sense of relief, but the situation wasn't over. He could still feel the weight of what had just happened. Would the police show up?
What would they say about this fight?
The man who had threatened James finally turned and stumbled toward the exit, his friends reluctantly following him. They weren't going to cause any more trouble. But James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. He had been on edge for a while now, and he didn't know what would happen next. Just as the door slammed shut behind the group, the restaurant fell silent again. The owner walked over to James, her face softening a little. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quieter now. James nodded, his body still tense, but beginning to relax.
"Yeah.
"I'm fine. I didn't want it to get this far, but it's over now." But even as he spoke, James knew that something still lingered. The group of men hadn't just been drunk or foolish. They had crossed a line, and James couldn't help but wonder. Why had they singled him out? What was it about him that had set them off? As the restaurant slowly returned to normal, James sat back down at his table, trying to shake off the adrenaline that was still buzzing through his veins. He wasn't afraid of a fight, but he was beginning to feel something more troubling, an uneasy sense that this encounter wasn't just an isolated incident. Outside, the sound of police sirens began to echo in the distance. What was going to happen next? Would the police find out the truth? Would James be able to walk out of this unscathed? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the night wore on. The distant wail of the sirens grew louder, and James could feel the tension in the restaurant tighten once again. The owner, still holding her phone, looked over at him, her brow furrowed in worry. James gave her a reassuring nod, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't concerned about the police showing up, he knew how to handle the authorities. It was the deeper, unspoken questions that gnawed at him. Why had the men attacked him so violently? Why had they targeted him in the first place? The restaurant was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. People who had been whispering or watching in fear now sat back down, but the eyes that lingered on James felt different. He wasn't just another diner anymore. He was the man who had taken down a drunk with a knife in a public place. There was no way to avoid the attention now. He tried to focus on calming his breath, but it wasn't easy. His hands were still slightly shaking from the rush of the fight, though his mind had begun to clear. The restaurant owner walked over to his table and sat down opposite him, her face soft but her eyes still filled with concern. "You did good. I wasn't sure what would happen when that guy pulled out a knife, but you handled it," she said, her voice calm but with an underlying trace of admiration. James nodded silently. He wasn't interested in praise. He just wanted to be left alone to enjoy his meal in peace. But something about the situation wasn't sitting right with him. It wasn't just the violence that bothered him. It was the way the man had seemed to target him. The way he'd been so quick to escalate things. He had to know why. Before he could say anything, the door to the restaurant opened again, and a uniformed police officer stepped inside. The officer was a tall, thin man with a stern face, scanning the room for the source of the disturbance. James could tell from his posture that the cop was a seasoned professional, the kind who had dealt with situations like this 100 times before. The officer's eyes swept over the room before landing on James. He walked over, his footsteps heavy with purpose. "Is this the man involved in the incident?" the officer asked the restaurant owner, his tone clipped. The owner nodded. "Yes, officer. He's the one who defended himself." The officer looked at James with a neutral expression, his gaze calculating. "Sir, I'm going to need to take your statement. We'll need you to come down to the station for questioning." James stood up slowly, his mind still trying to piece together everything that had happened. He wasn't afraid of going to the police station, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the whole situation. As the officer motioned for him to follow, the restaurant owner called after him. "I'll make sure to vouch for you, James. I saw everything, and you were just defending yourself." James gave her a small nod of gratitude before stepping outside with the officer. The cool night air hit him as he walked, the adrenaline finally beginning to subside. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the sound of distant traffic filled the silence. The police officer led him to the squad car parked on the curb, the lights flashing silently in the darkness. James wasn't worried. He had nothing to hide. He'd only defended himself when a man had tried to hurt him. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. He had no idea what the group of men might say, or what the police would make of the situation. As the officer opened the car door for him, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from his manager, Tom. "Hey, James. Just heard about the restaurant incident. Are you alright? Call me when you can." James sighed and put the phone back in his pocket. He would deal with it later. Right now, he needed to figure out what was going to happen next. The officer got into the driver's seat, and the car roared to life. As they drove through the city streets, James tried to focus on the road ahead. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, like everyone knew what had just happened. But even though the events had unfolded so quickly, there was still a sense of unease. He wasn't sure if it was just the adrenaline or something more, something that went deeper than the incident itself. The police station was only a few minutes away, but the ride felt like an eternity. When they arrived, the officer led James inside, and they passed through a series of hallways until they reached an interrogation room. The room was small, with a single table and 2 chairs. The officer gestured for James to sit. "Just give your statement, and we'll take it from there," the officer said, his voice flat and professional. James sat down, his hands resting on the table. The door shut behind him, and for a moment, all he could hear was the faint hum of the overhead lights. The silence was almost oppressive. He took a deep breath and began to recount everything that had happened at the restaurant, from the moment the group of men walked in to when the fight broke out. He didn't leave out any details, not even the part where he'd been forced to disarm the man who had pulled the knife. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, waiting for the officer's response. The officer nodded, taking notes on a pad in front of him. "All right. We'll need to get statements from the others who were there, but for now you're free to go. We might contact you later if we need further information." James stood up, his body still on high alert. He was ready to leave, but as he turned to walk out of the room, the officer stopped him. "Hold on," the officer said, his voice suddenly more serious. "I just need to ask you one more thing." James stopped, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" The officer hesitated for a moment, as though he wasn't sure how to approach the next question. "Do you know if those men have any connection to you beyond tonight? Were they targeting you specifically?" The question caught James off guard. I don't know. I don't think so. They just started trouble out of nowhere." The officer nodded slowly, as if he didn't fully believe him. "All right. Thanks for your time. You're free to go." James stepped out of the room, his mind racing. He had never encountered a situation like this before. Why had they come after him? What was their real motive? The whole thing felt like more than just a random encounter. There was something deeper to it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he walked out of the station and into the cool night air, James knew this wasn't over. The truth was still out there, and he was determined to find it. Little did he know, the answers he sought would take him down a path he never expected. The night was far from over, and James's unease only grew with each step he took. James stepped out of the police station, the chill in the air biting at his skin. His thoughts were in a haze as he tried to make sense of the night's events. He had been expecting something more straightforward, maybe just a quick statement, a brief interaction with the police, and then he'd go back to his normal life. But now, there were too many questions left unanswered. Why had those men singled him out? Was it just random? Or was there something else at play? The police officer's words echoed in his mind. "Do you know if those men have any connection to you beyond tonight?" James had told him honestly that he didn't know, but the officer had seemed skeptical. That bothered him. If it was just some random group of guys out for trouble, why had they been so quick to escalate things? Why had the man pulled a knife? The parking lot outside the station was nearly empty, save for a few cars scattered around. James walked toward his own vehicle, his mind still racing. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Tom. James pulled it out of his pocket. "James, I know this isn't easy, but we need to figure out what happened. These kinds of things can spiral fast, especially when the press gets involved. Just stay calm, and let's talk soon." James sighed. Tom was right. The media would surely catch wind of the incident soon. It wasn't every day a man fought off a knife-wielding attacker in a restaurant. He didn't want to get caught up in any kind of drama, but he knew how quickly things could escalate in the public eye. As he started his car and pulled away from the station, his thoughts turned back to the incident. He couldn't shake the feeling that the attack had been more than just some drunk guys looking for trouble. They had acted too aggressively, and the way the man had pulled the knife so quickly, it felt planned. James had seen enough in his life to know when things didn't add up. He decided he needed to talk to someone who might know more about what was going on. Someone who could help him figure out if there was more to this than met the eye. As he drove through the quiet streets, his phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a call from his old friend and former trainer, Eric. James immediately picked up. "Hey, Eric," James said, his voice a little tired. "What's up?" "James, man, I just heard about what happened," Eric replied, his tone sharp with concern. "Are you okay?" James leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. "I'm fine, but there's something about this whole thing that doesn't sit right with me. Those guys, especially the one with the knife, they seemed like they were targeting me for some reason." Eric was quiet for a moment. "You think this is something personal?" "I don't know," James said, rubbing his forehead.
But it feels that way.
"I don't get it. Why would they go after me like that?" "It wasn't just a random fight." Eric let out a low whistle. "That's not good. You might want to be careful, James. There are a lot of people who don't like what you do, especially in this town. And sometimes, people will try to make a name for themselves by messing with the wrong person." James's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "You're saying this could be connected to something bigger?" "Could be," Eric said. "I don't know for sure, but it's worth looking into. I'll make a few calls, see if I can find anything out. But you should lay low for a bit. Don't let anyone get a rise out of you." James nodded, even though he knew Eric couldn't see him. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'll keep my head down for now. Let me know what you find." After hanging up, James drove to his apartment, trying to shake the feeling that this night was far from over. He hadn't planned on dealing with anything like this. All he had wanted was a quiet meal. Now he was tangled in something he didn't fully understand. When he reached his building, he parked the car and took a deep breath before heading inside. The elevator ride up to his floor felt unusually long. As he stepped off and walked down the hallway to his apartment, the silence seemed to press in on him, making his skin prickle with unease. He unlocked his door and stepped inside, shutting it behind him. The small apartment was dimly lit, quiet, and felt strangely empty. It wasn't the kind of place where he normally thought about danger or violence. But tonight it felt different. He could still see the image of the man with the knife in his mind. He could still hear the taunts and the laughter. And no matter how many times he told himself it was just a one-time thing, a small part of him couldn't let it go. James walked over to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of water, trying to clear his head. The cool liquid slid down his throat, but it didn't do much to ease the tension in his chest. He had been through worse before. He'd fought in brutal matches, faced opponents who wanted nothing more than to see him on the mat, but this felt different. This wasn't a controlled fight in the ring. This was something more personal. He set the bottle down and ran his fingers through his hair, pacing around the apartment. Should he go back to the restaurant and talk to the owner again? Maybe she knew something that could shed light on why the men had targeted him. But even as he thought about it, James knew he wasn't going to get any answers by sitting here in his apartment. He needed to get out, to see things from a different angle. He grabbed his jacket and headed back out the door, locking it behind him. As he made his way back to the car, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. Breaking news: local restaurant altercation turns violent. Boxer James Carter involved in public fight with group of men. Details emerging. The headline hit James like a punch to the gut. This was the last thing he needed, his name plastered all over the news for something like this. The police had probably given a report already. How would this look to the public? To his fans? To his career? His grip on the phone tightened, and for the first time, James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about what came next. As he drove back toward the restaurant, he felt more certain than ever. Someone was trying to make a statement, and he was caught in the middle of it. This wasn't going to end with a simple apology. The questions were mounting, and it was clear this was only the beginning. The restaurant was still quiet when he arrived, but as he walked inside, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. A man in a black hoodie was standing near the counter, watching him intently. James didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that made James feel like he was being watched. Something wasn't right. The man didn't speak, but as James moved further inside, the man turned and walked out the door. His gut told him this was no coincidence. The pieces were slowly starting to come together, and James couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Would the mysterious man lead to answers, or new dangers for James? The door swung shut with a soft chime as the man in the hoodie walked out of the restaurant. James's eyes followed him, his instincts on high alert. There was something in the way the man moved, in the way he glanced over his shoulder as if he was making sure James was watching him. It wasn't normal. James stayed rooted to the spot for a moment, wondering if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as the seconds ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced around the restaurant, but the few patrons who remained were too absorbed in their meals to pay attention to what was happening. The owner was behind the counter, cleaning up the mess from the earlier chaos, but she didn't seem to notice the man or his strange behavior. James walked quickly toward the door, not wanting to lose sight of the man. The chilly night air hit him as he stepped outside, but he didn't let it distract him. He scanned the parking lot, but there was no sign of the man. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air. For a moment, James considered just going back inside. But something in his gut told him he couldn't let this go. His feet moved before he could think, taking him around the side of the building. The alley behind the restaurant was dark and quiet, the only sound the faint hum of traffic in the distance. He was almost ready to give up when he spotted a shadow in the far corner of the alley. The man was standing there, facing away from James, as if waiting for something or someone. James approached cautiously, not wanting to make a sound. He wasn't sure who this man was or why he was following him, but the unease growing in his chest only intensified the closer he got. The man didn't hear him, and James took the opportunity to speak. "Hey," he called, his voice firm. "What do you want?" The man stiffened at the sound of James's voice, then slowly turned around. James took in the figure standing before him. Tall, thin, with a hard look in his eyes. His hoodie was pulled low over his face, casting a shadow that obscured his features. But there was something familiar about him, something that made James's heart race. "You're the boxer," the man said, his voice low and cold. James didn't reply right away. His mind raced, trying to place where he had seen the man before. But nothing came to him. There was no recognition. "What do you want from me?" James repeated, stepping closer. The man smirked, a slight, almost mocking smile that made James's blood run cold. "I'm not here to fight you." "Not yet, anyway," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. James frowned, his senses heightening. This wasn't a random encounter. He could feel it in his bones. "Then why are you following me?" James asked, his voice a little louder this time. "Who sent you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving James's face. He seemed to be studying him, like a predator analyzing its prey. James's heart rate quickened. This wasn't just a chance meeting. This was personal. But who was behind this? And why target him? The man finally spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "You're in the way. You've been in the way for a long time. But don't worry, you won't be for much longer." James narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean? Who are you working for?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold contempt. "You'll find out soon enough. But know this. You won't be walking away from this mess. Not unless you start playing the game." Without another word, The man turned and walked toward the end of the alley, disappearing into the shadows. James stood there for a moment, his mind racing. The words echoed in his head. "You won't be walking away unless you start playing the game." What did that mean? Was someone really out to get him? Who would want to target a professional boxer, especially one who had just been trying to enjoy a meal? The whole situation was becoming more complicated with each passing minute. He stood in the alley for a while longer, hoping the man might come back or give him more answers. But the silence that settled over him was deafening. Finally, he made his way back to the restaurant. The owner was still cleaning up, though the atmosphere was much quieter now, the earlier chaos fading into the background. James didn't know what to do next. The man in the hoodie had given him a warning, but it was clear there was something more going on. Something dangerous. The restaurant owner looked up as James entered. "You okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. James nodded, though he wasn't sure he felt okay. "I'm fine," he said. "Just had a little conversation with someone who's got a bone to pick with me." The owner's brow furrowed. Who was it? Was he one of the guys from earlier? James shook his head. "No, this guy wasn't with them. But it looks like I've got bigger problems now." The owner sighed. "I don't like this. Something about tonight doesn't sit right with me either." "Be careful, James. These things, they can escalate quickly." James gave her a nod, though his thoughts were already elsewhere. There was no point in staying at the restaurant any longer. He needed to figure out what was going on. He needed answers. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't help but wonder if he was already too deep in something he couldn't control. He had spent years in the ring, taking on opponents who had no problem trying to knock him out. But this was different. The man in the hoodie hadn't just been trying to intimidate him. He had been sending a message. The car ride home was a blur. The streets outside his window seemed to pass in slow motion, and James's mind raced with questions. Who was after him?
Why now? And what did he mean by the game?
By the time he reached his apartment, he was more confused than ever. But as he walked through the door and locked it behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. This time, it was a message from Eric. "James, I've been doing some digging. It's worse than I thought.
You need to watch your back.
Someone's been making moves in the shadows, and I think you're their next target. Be careful. I'll keep you posted." James stared at the message for a long moment, the weight of Eric's words sinking in. Whatever game this was, James was in the middle of it. And the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. The man in the hoodie hadn't been the only one watching him. There was a bigger picture here, and James wasn't sure if he was ready to face it.
But he didn't have a choice.
The game had already begun. Would James be able to find out who was behind the threat, or would he fall deeper into the web of danger closing in on him? The room felt smaller than it usually did as James sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still clutched tightly in his hand. Eric's message kept playing in his mind over and over again. "Someone's been making moves in the shadows, and I think you're their next target." James had always been able to rely on his instincts, but they were telling him more than ever that things were spiraling out of control. The man in the hoodie had sent a clear warning, but who was behind it?
And why?
Why was he, a professional boxer, being dragged into something so dangerous? He tried to push the questions aside, but they kept circling, growing louder. He had trained his whole life to be strong in the ring, but this wasn't a fight he was used to. He wasn't sure who the enemy was, or how to even begin defending himself. There was one thing he was sure of, though. He couldn't do this alone. The people around him, especially Eric, were starting to uncover pieces of something bigger. But he didn't know if they could keep up with whatever game was being played. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. James stood up, the tension in his shoulders not easing even a little bit. He wasn't expecting anyone. Was it the police, following up on the earlier incident? Or was it someone else, someone who had something more to say? James cautiously walked over to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing on the other side was a familiar face, Tom, his manager. The man was always in a suit, businesslike even at odd hours. Reluctantly, James opened the door. "Tom," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" Tom stepped inside without waiting for a response, his face serious. "We need to talk, James. It's about last night." James shut the door behind him, locking it. "I figured. I'm guessing the news coverage has hit you, huh?" Tom nodded, pulling out his phone. "I just saw the headlines. This has escalated more than we thought. The press is already starting to pick up on it. They'll be all over you unless we get ahead of it." James sighed. He had been trying to avoid the media circus, but now it seemed inevitable. "I don't care about the press. I care about the guy with the knife."
Who is he?
"And why is he after me?" Tom's expression hardened. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. There's something more going on here, and I don't think you're just some random target." "Tell me something I don't know," James muttered under his breath. He was frustrated with the lack of answers, with the sense of danger that loomed over him, and with the helplessness that was creeping in. Tom studied him for a moment. "James, listen to me. These kinds of things don't just happen. I've been in this business long enough to know when something's off. And this is off. That man, the one who attacked you, he's not just some drunk idiot. There's a bigger picture here. But right now, I need you to trust me. We need to move quickly." James's brows furrowed. "What do you mean by move quickly?" Tom's eyes flicked nervously around the room. "I've got a contact. Someone who can help us dig into this. He's been watching the situation from the outside, and he thinks you're in danger. But he needs your cooperation." "Who is this contact?" James asked, crossing his arms. "And why should I trust him?" Tom hesitated, then spoke quietly. "His name is Marcus. He's an old friend of mine, but I haven't heard from him in years. He's into things that I don't want to fully get into. But he's the kind of guy who knows people. He's connected, and right now, that's exactly what we need." James stood there considering his options. He had never liked dealing with shady people or going outside the lines of the law, but it seemed like that was the direction everything was headed. He didn't know who to trust anymore, and that frightened him more than anything. Tom was watching him, waiting for an answer. Finally, James spoke. "All right, get me in touch with him. But I need to know everything. No more secrets." Tom nodded. "I'll set it up. But James, don't trust anyone blindly. This goes deeper than we realize. The people behind this, they won't stop at just you." The words sent a chill down James's spine. What kind of people would go this far? He had fought in the ring for years, but this was a fight on a whole new level. The next morning, James found himself standing outside a rundown building on the edge of town, the kind of place most people would avoid. The area felt quiet, almost too quiet. It was the kind of place you only came to when you had no other choice. Tom had arranged the meeting with Marcus, and now it was time to face whatever came next. As James stepped up to the door, he glanced around, his senses heightened. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. He felt like something was closing in on him. Whatever game had been set in motion the night before, he was about to dive deeper into it. And there was no turning back. The door creaked open, and Marcus stood there, a tall man with a stony expression and a scruffy beard. His dark eyes studied James for a moment before he stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "James Carter, huh?" Marcus said gruffly, closing the door behind him. "I've heard a lot about you." James didn't like the way Marcus said that. It sounded more like a warning than a greeting. "What's going on, Marcus?" James asked, getting straight to the point. "Who's behind all this? Why the hell are they after me?" Marcus motioned for James to sit, then took a seat across from him. "It's not just about you, James," he said, his voice low. "It's about what you represent. And there's someone powerful who wants to make sure you don't get in their way." James leaned forward, his fists clenching. "I don't care about any power games. I just want to know who's behind this, and why they're trying to drag me into it." Marcus paused, looking at James carefully. "You're about to find out. But I'm warning you now, once you step into this, there's no turning back." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James wasn't sure what kind of mess he was stepping into, but one thing was clear: it was much bigger than anything he had ever faced in the ring. As Marcus leaned forward to explain, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something much darker than just a random fight. And he had no idea how far this would go. What was Marcus about to reveal? Would James be able to handle the truth, or would the game prove too dangerous? Marcus leaned forward, his face shadowed in the dim light of the room. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking. You're not just a boxer, James. You've been under the radar for years, but you've been on the radar of the wrong people for just as long. James furrowed his brow. What do you mean? I'm just a fighter. I've been focused on my career, nothing more. Marcus shook his head slowly. That's where you're wrong. You've been doing more than just fighting. You've built a name for yourself. And while you've been in the ring, a lot of people in the shadows have been keeping tabs on you. James stood up abruptly, the words from Marcus hitting harder than he expected. What are you talking about? Who are these people? Marcus held up a hand, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. Listen, you need to calm down. I'm telling you, these people are big. They've got power, they've got resources, and they've got connections that can make your life miserable. It's not just some random thug with a knife. It's organized. And it's about more than just you. James was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of Marcus's words. His heart raced in his chest as he tried to wrap his mind around what Marcus was saying. Was he really involved in something this far-reaching? So, who are these people? And why the hell am I involved? James finally managed to say, his voice edged with frustration. Marcus took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, as though considering how much to reveal. There's a group. Call them an organization, or whatever you want. They're involved in a lot of things. You've probably heard of them. Big-time criminals, powerful people. But there's one man at the top who's the key to everything. His name is Darren Novak. James felt a shiver run down his spine. The name didn't ring a bell, but the way Marcus said it made it clear that Darren Novak was someone he needed to be wary of. Who is he? James asked, his voice low. Novak's the kind of man who pulls strings behind the scenes, and people like you, people who get too much attention, too much power, become a problem for him, Marcus continued. You've got a reputation in the media. You've been successful, and people know your name. Novak doesn't like that. He doesn't like people stepping out of the shadows. So he sends his people to deal with them. James's mind spun. So, you're telling me Novak is behind these attacks? The man with the knife? The guy who pushed me around in the restaurant? Marcus nodded gravely.
Yeah.
It's part of a bigger play. Novak uses intimidation, manipulation, and violence to control people, to silence them when they get in his way. Those men in the restaurant, they were his pawns. They were meant to scare you, to break you down. James clenched his fists, trying to hold on to his temper. So they want to scare me?
To break me?
That's what this is all about. Marcus sighed, his gaze intense. It's more than that. You've been on their radar for a while now, and they're testing you. They're seeing how far they can push you. But there's more to this. You're not just a pawn in Novak's game, James. He sees you as a threat. You've got something he wants. James's mind was racing now, trying to make sense of everything Marcus was saying. What could I possibly have that he wants? I'm just a boxer, a fighter. What could Novak want with me? Marcus shook his head. It's not about your fighting skills, James. It's about your influence, your ability to reach people. Novak is always looking for ways to manipulate those in power, and you've got a kind of power in the public eye that he could use. He needs people who can move crowds, sway opinions, and right now you're in his way. That's why he's targeting you. James's pulse quickened as everything started to click into place. He had always known that being in the public eye came with risks, but he never imagined it could go this far. And now, this dark figure, Darren Novak, was watching him from the shadows, trying to break him down. Marcus's expression grew darker. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. They're not going to stop. They'll keep coming after you, pulling strings and manipulating people until you either break or bend. And right now, they're testing you to see how much you can handle. James exhaled sharply, feeling a wave of anger surge within him. This wasn't just about a restaurant fight anymore. This wasn't just a random attack. This was something much bigger. And Novak's reach extended far beyond what James could have imagined. So what do I do? James asked, his voice sharp with determination. How do I stop them? Marcus stood up, walking toward the window and looking out into the darkened streets below. You don't just stop them, James. You fight back. You hit them where it hurts, and you take them down piece by piece. But you have to be careful. Novak doesn't play fair. You can't just go in swinging. James's jaw tightened as he absorbed Marcus's words. He had faced countless opponents in the ring, but this was a fight on a completely different level. This wasn't about punches or physical strength. This was about survival, about outsmarting an enemy who had been pulling strings in the dark for too long. We'll need to gather information, Marcus continued, his voice steady. We need to find out everything we can about Novak and his people. You're going to have to work with me and stay under the radar. It won't be easy, but if you want to take him down, you'll need all the help you can get. James felt a fire ignite in his chest. This wasn't the type of fight he had trained for, but he had been through enough in his life to know when to stand tall. He wasn't going to let some shadowy criminal take control of his life. He wouldn't be a pawn. I'm in, James said firmly. Let's do this. The days that followed were a blur. Marcus worked in the shadows, making contacts, gathering intel, and trying to piece together everything they could about Darren Novak's empire. James had to stay low, avoiding public appearances, and trying to keep a low profile while Marcus did his work. But it wasn't long before they started to get leads, small details about Novak's operations, his inner circle, and the people who worked for him. James was learning things he never thought he would have to know, about underground dealings, covert operations, and the dark underbelly of the world that he had never seen before. And the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though Novak's people were always one step ahead, anticipating their every move. And James knew that, sooner or later, Novak would make his next move. The question was, would James be ready when it came? As Marcus dug deeper, James found himself wondering how far he was willing to go in this fight. Would he be able to protect those he cared about while facing down one of the most dangerous men in the world? The clock was ticking, and Novak's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. The days felt heavier, each one dragging as James found himself sinking deeper into the world Marcus had pulled him into. His normal routine was gone. There was no more training at the gym, no more quiet evenings. Everything was overshadowed by the looming presence of Darren Novak and the dangerous game he had been forced into. Marcus had managed to track down a few of Novak's associates, but they were elusive, careful. It was clear they weren't going to make it easy for them to gather information. Each lead came with a price, each piece of intel with a trail of danger that seemed to follow them. James had been moving cautiously, keeping his public appearances to a minimum. He was constantly aware of the eyes on him, the feeling that he was being watched. It was like something invisible was closing in on him, something he couldn't shake off. Even in his apartment, the silence seemed to carry a weight, like there was a shadow in every corner. Then, one evening, Marcus called him with urgent news. "James, I've got something," Marcus said over the phone, his voice low and tense. "You need to come to the warehouse. It's time." The tone in Marcus's voice sent a shiver down James's spine. He hadn't heard that urgency in his friend's voice before. Something was about to happen, and James wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, far from the busy streets and prying eyes. James parked his car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, keeping to the shadows. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. It felt like the perfect setting for a confrontation, dark, isolated, and full of uncertainty. As James approached the warehouse, he noticed the area was eerily quiet. No cars, no movement. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were walking straight into a trap. When he entered, the heavy door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Boxes were stacked along the walls, and the air smelled of dust and metal. Marcus was standing in the center of the room, his back to the door, his face tense. "James," Marcus greeted him quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "You're just in time." James took a step forward. "What's going on, Marcus? What did you find?" Marcus motioned for James to come closer, then nodded toward a large table in the corner of the room. Spread across it were several files, papers, and photographs. Information, James realized, that had been collected over weeks of research. It was clear they were dealing with something much bigger than James had initially thought. "I got a lead on Novak's operations," Marcus explained. "He's been working with some powerful people in the city. He's not just running a criminal empire, he's got ties to corporate elites, politicians, even law enforcement. This isn't just a street-level operation. He's a spider, and the city is his web." James scanned the table, his eyes landing on one of the photographs. It was a picture of a man in a sharp suit, standing beside Novak. James didn't recognize him, but Marcus's eyes narrowed when he saw it. "That's Garrett Hawk," Marcus said, his voice tinged with frustration. "He's one of Novak's closest allies. He's got his hands in everything from construction contracts to illegal arms deals. If Novak's the head of the snake, Hawk's the one who makes sure the money keeps flowing." James's heart sank. The deeper they dug, the more complicated things became. Novak wasn't just some local thug. It was all part of a much larger operation, one that stretched deep into the heart of the city's power structure. Marcus shuffled through a few more files and handed James a piece of paper with an address on it. "I've got a location. It's one of Novak's front businesses. If we can get inside and gather some hard evidence, we can take him down." James looked at the address, weighing his options. It felt like the first real lead they had, the first piece of concrete information they could use. But as he looked at Marcus, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the point of no return. "You're sure about this?" James asked, his voice cautious. "You're sure this is the right place?" Marcus nodded. "It's our best shot. But I need you to understand something, James. Once we move on this, there's no going back. If Novak finds out we've got this information, he'll come for us, and he won't stop until we're either in the ground or under his control. He's not someone who lets things slide." James gritted his teeth. He had known the risks from the beginning, but now that he was staring them in the face, they felt heavier. This wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a war. And war meant casualties. "I'm in," James said finally, determination settling into his bones. "We take him down, together." The plan was set. They would move on Novak's front business that night, under the cover of darkness. Marcus had arranged for a small crew of trusted contacts to help them get inside the building. It wasn't going to be easy, but if they succeeded, they would have the evidence they needed to bring Novak's empire down. As James prepared for the mission, his mind raced. It wasn't the fight he had imagined when he first stepped into the boxing ring. This wasn't about physical strength or quick reflexes. This was about strategy, stealth, and knowing when to strike. They met at a small safe house on the edge of town, a place far enough removed from Novak's influence that they could lay low without drawing attention. Marcus went over the final details of the plan, outlining who would do what and when. "We stick to the plan," Marcus said firmly. "No improvising. We get in, get the information, and get out. No heroics. We're not here to take Novak down ourselves. We're here to bring back the proof that'll bring him down." James nodded. He was ready. They had a plan, and he wasn't going to let fear or uncertainty get in his way. As they set out toward the location, the adrenaline coursing through James's veins made his heart race. Every step he took felt like a step toward something big. But even as they neared the building, a feeling of unease settled in his stomach. Something wasn't right. Novak's people were smart. They were always watching, always waiting for the right moment. The warehouse loomed ahead, silent and foreboding, the shadows seeming to stretch out like a warning. James felt like he was walking into the lion's den. But it was too late to back out now. Would they be able to infiltrate Novak's operation and gather the evidence they needed? Or would the web Novak had spun tighten around them before they could escape? The warehouse was dark, save for the faint glow of security lights that flickered intermittently from above. James's breath was steady, but his senses were heightened, every movement, every shadow, catching his attention. His feet moved silently over the gravel as he, Marcus, and the small crew of contacts approached the building. The plan was simple: get in, get the documents, and get out. But James knew things were rarely as simple as they seemed. They reached the rear of the building, where a small door stood slightly ajar. Marcus motioned for them to stop. He crouched down, peering through a crack in the door, assessing the situation. "Two guards inside," Marcus whispered, his voice low. They're armed. We need to take them out quietly. James nodded, his heart pounding. He wasn't a stranger to taking down opponents, but this felt different. This wasn't a fight in the ring. It was a silent battle, and one wrong move could put them all in danger. Without a word, James and another member of the crew, a tall man named Victor, slipped inside, their movements fluid and practiced. The guards were talking to each other, their voices muffled, unaware of the approaching danger. James and Victor positioned themselves carefully. They needed to neutralize the guards without making any noise, without drawing attention to themselves. James's years of training gave him the edge in moments like these. His footfalls were silent as he crept up behind the first guard. A swift move, a hand over the mouth, a quick strike to the pressure point, and the guard collapsed into his arms. Victor followed suit, taking down the second guard with similar precision. The two men were out cold, no alarms triggered. James exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Clear," Marcus whispered, his voice cutting through the silence. James and Victor dragged the unconscious men to the side, out of sight, before joining Marcus and the others inside the main building. The warehouse was cluttered with crates and boxes, the smell of old wood and metal hanging in the air. The low hum of machinery in the distance made it clear they weren't alone, but they had no time to waste. "We've got to move fast," Marcus said, his tone urgent. "The documents should be in the office at the far end of the building. But Novak's people will be here any minute." They moved quickly, weaving through the maze of crates. Every corner was a potential threat, every sound amplified in the tense silence. James's mind raced, his eyes scanning the space for any movement. They had come so far, but the closer they got to Novak's inner sanctum, the more James felt the weight of the danger closing in around them. Finally, they reached the office door. Marcus pulled out a set of tools and quickly picked the lock, the sound of the mechanism clicking echoing in the quiet room. He pushed the door open slowly, his eyes darting inside. Inside was a small, windowless room, cluttered with files, papers, and computers. But it was clear this was Novak's operations hub. Everything James needed was here. The only problem was that they didn't have much time. Marcus gestured for James to start searching the files while he handled the computers. As James sifted through the documents on the desk, his heart pounded in his chest. There were contracts, business dealings, photographs of people he didn't recognize, but as he flipped through the stack, something caught his eye. A folder, neatly labeled with the words Project Alpha written across the top. James pulled it out and opened it. Inside were blueprints, detailed plans, drawings, and contracts with names he didn't recognize but that made his blood run cold. There were mentions of arms deals, illegal activities, and financial transactions, all tied to Novak's operation. But what stood out most were the names at the bottom of some of the documents, high-profile city officials, politicians, even law enforcement. Novak wasn't just some criminal mastermind. He had ties in all the right places. James's fingers shook as he went through the folder, each page revealing more and more about the web Novak had spun. He wasn't just running a criminal empire. He was working to control the very fabric of the city itself. "We've got what we need," Marcus said, his voice tight. He was already halfway through searching the computer files. "Let's get out of here before Novak's people show up." But as Marcus reached for the final set of files, a noise shattered the silence. A loud crack, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Someone had found them. "Move now," Marcus shouted, his voice urgent. "We've been compromised." James grabbed the folder with the documents, tucking it under his arm, and followed Marcus and the others as they dashed for the back door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and panic began to set in. They had to move fast. If Novak's people caught up to them, all their hard work would be for nothing. As they neared the back exit, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. James stopped short, his eyes narrowing. It was one of Novak's men, armed, with a smug smile on his face. Well, the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "Looks like you've found something you shouldn't have." Without thinking, James lunged forward, his fist connecting with the man's face in one clean strike. The man staggered back, momentarily stunned, but then reached for the gun at his side. Before the man could pull the trigger, Marcus stepped forward, disarming him with a swift move. The gun clattered to the floor as the man dropped to the ground, unconscious. "Come on, we don't have time," Marcus urged, pulling James and the others toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, a loud explosion rang out from the other side of the building. The entire warehouse shook, and a blinding flash of light illuminated the room. The walls trembled, and James felt himself thrown to the ground as the shockwave hit. "What the hell was that?" James yelled, his ears ringing from the blast. "We've been set up," Marcus hissed, pulling James to his feet. "We need to get out now." The sound of shouting and footsteps grew louder, and James realized they were surrounded. Novak's men had anticipated their every move. The escape route had been compromised, and there was no way out but through the front, where more of Novak's people waited. "Time's up," Marcus muttered, his face grim. "We got one shot at this." Would they be able to escape the trap set for them, or would Novak's men close in on them before they could get away? The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. The blast still reverberated in James's ears, his body still absorbing the shock of the explosion as Marcus dragged him forward. The air inside the warehouse had turned thick with dust, the acrid smell of smoke filling his lungs. The once quiet building now felt like a war zone, and every step they took seemed to be pushing them deeper into the chaos. "Move," Marcus shouted, his grip tight on James's arm as he pulled him through the narrow hallway toward the back exit. The other members of their small crew were already ahead of them, but it was clear they had no clear path out. The entire warehouse seemed to be coming apart around them. The sound of men shouting and running toward them echoed from every direction. James's heart raced as he looked over his shoulder. The entrance they'd planned to use was now blocked by a wall of flames and debris. The exit was no longer an option. Panic set in. His thoughts scrambled to keep up with the reality that was unfolding. Novak's men had anticipated their every move, and now they were trapped. "Where do we go?" James gasped, still running but now feeling the tight grip of uncertainty clamping down on him. "We're going straight through," Marcus answered, determination in his voice despite the chaos around them. "We need to break through the front. That's our only shot." James knew the plan sounded reckless, but what other choice did they have? They couldn't go back, they couldn't stay in the warehouse any longer. The building was quickly becoming a death trap, and time was running out. As they sprinted toward the front of the building, the sounds of Novak's men closing and intensified. The hallway ahead was illuminated by flickering lights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every step James took felt heavier as the reality of their situation pressed in on him. His mind raced with questions. Why had Novak let them get this far? Had this all been part of a larger plan to lure them in? The answers were out of reach. The front door came into view, and James felt his pulse quicken. But as he reached for the handle, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind him, and a voice called out, "Stop right there." James whirled around just as one of Novak's men appeared in the doorway. Armed, his face twisted with cold determination. The man didn't hesitate, raising his weapon and aiming it directly at James. For a moment, everything froze. James's mind went blank. He knew that one wrong move could end everything. But just as the man fired, James dove to the side, hitting the floor hard and sliding behind a stack of crates. The bullet missed by inches, but the shock of the shot rattled him. His heart pounded in his chest. "Go! Go!" Marcus shouted, pulling James to his feet and shoving him toward the front door. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them as Novak's men rushed forward, but they didn't have time to look back. James pushed himself harder, his body screaming in protest as he ran. The exit was just ahead, but as they neared it, they saw another figure blocking their way. More of Novak's men. They were trapped. Marcus cursed under his breath and turned to James. "Get ready. We fight our way out." James's instincts kicked in as he moved to the front. He wasn't about to let Novak's men take him down now, not when they were so close. His heart still raced, but now there was only one thing on his mind: survival. The first of Novak's men lunged forward, but James was faster. He sidestepped the man's attack, catching him off guard before delivering a powerful blow that sent him sprawling to the ground. Another man came at him from the side, but James ducked low, using the momentum to knock him off balance and send him tumbling to the floor. "Keep moving," Marcus urged, his voice strained. "We've got to break through now." James didn't hesitate. They moved forward in a blur, each moment a rush of adrenaline. They were so close. But as they reached the door, a final figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes. "Darren Novak," Marcus spat, recognizing him immediately. James didn't know who he was dealing with, but the man's presence made the air feel thick and heavy. Novak was the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated everything, pulling strings from the shadows, making sure they'd never see the full picture. And now, here he was standing in front of them. "Did you really think you could just walk in here and take what doesn't belong to you?" Novak's voice was low, almost mocking. "You've made a very big mistake." James felt the weight of Novak's words settle over him, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. The fight wasn't over. "Not yet. You're the one who's made the mistake," James said, his voice steady despite the tension mounting in his chest. "You should have never come after me." Novak smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I didn't come after you, James. I came after everything you stand for. You're just a pawn in my game, and now you're about to be taken off the board." The words hit harder than James expected, but he didn't let them show. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let Novak win. In a flash, Novak reached for something on his belt, and James instinctively moved forward, trying to close the gap. It was too late. Novak pulled out a small device and pressed a button. The warehouse lit up, and a shrill alarm blared overhead. The sound of footsteps pounding from all directions signaled the arrival of reinforcements. "We're surrounded," Marcus yelled, his voice sharp with urgency. James felt his stomach drop as Novak's men closed in from all sides. They were trapped again. But just as panic began to settle in, Marcus pulled out a small piece of equipment and clicked it on. A loud beeping sound echoed through the air as the building's lights flickered off, and the door behind them swung open. "We've got a way out," Marcus said, relief in his voice. "Go." James didn't need to be told twice. He dashed toward the exit, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder. Novak's men were close, too close, but for the first time that night, James felt like they had a chance. They rushed through the door and into the darkness outside, breathing in the cool night air as they sprinted toward the alley where Marcus's car was waiting. The plan had worked. For now. But as they sped away from the chaos of the warehouse, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface of something much bigger than they had realized. Novak had let them go, but for how long? And what would happen next? The documents they had secured were only the beginning. James didn't know what kind of fight he was in, but one thing was certain. He couldn't back down now. The war had only just begun. What would Novak's next move be? And could James and Marcus survive the full force of his empire? The car sped through the narrow streets, the tires screeching as Marcus navigated the winding roads. James sat in the back, his body still tense from the chaos they had just escaped. His heart was racing, but he couldn't afford to relax, not yet. Novak's men were still out there, and even though they had escaped the immediate danger, James knew it wasn't over. It never was when someone like Novak was involved. The city passed in a blur, the streetlights casting long shadows over the empty roads. The adrenaline from their escape was slowly fading, but James's mind was working overtime. He kept replaying the moment they'd come face to face with Novak, the way he'd spoken with such calm confidence, like he was always in control. "That was too close," Marcus said, his voice gruff. "We can't keep doing this, James. We can't keep running in and out, hoping to get lucky every time." James nodded, still processing everything. "I know, but we got what we needed. The documents. Novak's empire isn't invincible. We can bring him down." Marcus glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "We can try, but Novak's no fool. He won't just sit back and let us take him down. And with the connections he's got, it's only a matter of time before he starts hitting back hard. We need to figure out our next move, and fast." James was quiet for a moment, his eyes staring out the window as the city lights flickered by. His thoughts kept returning to the folder they had grabbed from the warehouse, the detailed plans, the names of politicians and law enforcement officials, the evidence that tied Novak's operation to the very fabric of the city. But what good was it if they couldn't get it into the right hands? The silence in the car felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond their reach. James didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: he had to keep moving forward. He had to take down Novak, no matter the cost. "You're right," James finally said, his voice steady. "But we can't stop now. We have the evidence. It's time to go public. We get it to the right people, police, media, whoever will listen, and let Novak know we're coming for him." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was clearly thinking it over, his eyes focused on the road. Finally, he spoke, his tone a little more guarded.
"It's risky, James.
Novak's network runs deep. We expose him, and we'll have a target on our backs. There's no going back once we pull that trigger." James met his gaze in the rearview mirror, determination hardening in his chest. "I'm not afraid of a fight.
This isn't about me.
It's about taking down something that's been poisoning this city for years. We have to do this." Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment, the car seemed to get even quieter, as if the weight of James's words was settling into the very air around them. Finally, Marcus let out a long breath. "All right, we'll do it your way. But we need to act fast. First things first, we need to lay low for a bit. Novak won't be content just waiting around. He'll come after us. So we'll stay off the radar, keep our heads down, and prepare for the next step." James nodded, his mind already working on the plan. The first priority was getting the documents out of their hands and into the right channels: law enforcement, journalists, whoever would have the courage to stand up to Novak and his empire. But doing that wasn't as simple as just walking into a police station. Novak had too many connections, too many powerful people on his side. One wrong move, and they could all be dead before the truth even had a chance to come out. The days that followed were tense. James and Marcus holed up in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was secure, and for now it would have to do. The weight of the documents and what they contained felt like a constant pressure on James's shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were always being watched, always one step away from being discovered. Marcus worked tirelessly, setting up secure channels for their information to be shared. He made contact with a few trusted allies, people who owed him favors, people who could help them get the truth to the right people. But every step forward was met with resistance, and the danger of discovery loomed larger with each passing day. James spent his time going over the documents again and again, trying to make sense of everything. The contracts, the names, the plans. It was a tangled web that stretched far beyond what he had expected. Novak wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes, and the city's entire power structure was his stage. One night, as James was reviewing the files once more, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom. "James, I've got something. I don't know how much you trust me right now, but I've been digging into Novak. I've got some intel, and it's big. We need to meet. I'll send you the location." James stared at the message for a long moment. Tom had been in the background throughout all of this, but James had no way of knowing if he could still trust him. The situation had become too complicated, and everyone had their own agenda. Before he could respond, Marcus walked into the room, his expression grim. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing the tension on James's face. James held up the phone. "Tom's got something. He says it's big. But I don't know if we can trust him. We can't afford any more surprises." Marcus paused, considering the situation. Tom's been a reliable contact in the past, but things are different now. We can't afford to be naive. If we meet him, we need to be prepared for anything. James nodded, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "I'm going. But I'm not going alone. You're coming with me." The meeting place was an old diner on the outskirts of town, one of those places that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. When they arrived, the place was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons. The neon sign flickered above them as they entered. Tom was already there, sitting at a corner booth, his usual businesslike demeanor replaced by an anxious energy. He looked up as they approached, his eyes darting between them. "James. Marcus," Tom said, his voice strained. "I've been working my connections. I've got something that could bring Novak down for good." Marcus glanced at James before responding. "We're listening, Tom. But you'd better make it good. Time's running out." Tom nodded, his fingers trembling slightly as he slid a manila envelope across the table. "Inside this, you'll find everything you need to take Novak down. I've got names, locations, financial records, all the proof you need." James didn't waste a moment. He opened the envelope and pulled out the contents, scanning through the papers quickly. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were more names of people in high places, law enforcement, politicians, everyone who had a hand in Novak's operations. This is huge," James said, his voice low. "How did you get this?" Tom hesitated for a moment before speaking, his gaze shifting uneasily. "I've been working with a few people who have insight into Novak's network. But the problem is, he knows I've been digging. He's onto me." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "So, you're saying Novak knows you've been helping us?" Tom nodded. "I don't know how much longer I've got. But I had to get this information to you. It's the only chance you've got to take him down." James looked at Marcus, the weight of the decision settling heavily on him. They were so close to the truth, to ending everything Novak had built. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore. Tom had just put his life on the line. And Novak wouldn't take kindly to someone betraying him. "We have to act fast," James said, slamming the papers down on the table. "This is our shot." The plan was set. They would take the documents to the authorities, expose Novak's entire operation. But as they left the diner, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The game had changed, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Would they be able to expose Novak for good, or would his empire prove too powerful to topple? The weight of the decision settled heavily on James's shoulders. The documents Tom had provided contained the final pieces of the puzzle, but taking them to the authorities wasn't as simple as walking into a police station. They were up against a man who had deep ties in both the criminal underworld and the city's highest offices. Novak had eyes everywhere, and if they weren't careful, they'd never make it out alive. But they had no other choice. It was time to end this. Marcus drove them to the police precinct, the tension in the car almost suffocating. The city lights flickered as they moved through the streets, and James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed, every shadow that moved, made him wonder if Novak's men were already closing in on them. But this was it. The documents had to be handed over, and the truth had to come out. They parked a few blocks away from the precinct to avoid drawing attention, moving quickly to a safe location. James kept a hand on the folder containing the documents, the proof that could bring down Novak's empire. When they reached the precinct, they split up, moving through separate entrances to avoid being seen together. James made his way to a back office, where a trusted contact of Marcus's was waiting, a cop who had worked under the radar for years, someone who had a reputation for doing the right thing, even if it meant risking his career. "Is this it?" the officer asked when James handed him the envelope. His eyes scanned the contents with a practiced glance, quickly assessing the significance of what they had brought. James nodded. "This is everything. The full operation. Novak has his fingers in every pie, from illegal arms deals to the highest levels of government. This is the evidence you need to put him away for good." The officer didn't speak for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up, his voice low. "You know what this means, right? If I take this to the higher-ups, it's going to get messy. Novak will retaliate. He's got people everywhere, even inside the department. We can't afford any slip-ups." James met his gaze. "We're already in this deep. We can't back out now. We have to bring him down, before he has a chance to destroy us first." The officer exhaled slowly, glancing over his shoulder as if checking to see if they were being watched. "All right. I'll do it. But you need to get out of here. Stay low. If Novak finds out who helped you, there's no telling what he'll do." James nodded, his heart pounding. He knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. The documents were in the right hands. The truth was out. The next few days were a blur. Marcus and James stayed hidden, taking refuge in safe houses and communicating through encrypted channels. They watched as the first reports about Novak's empire began to surface in the media. The police had acted quickly, raiding multiple locations tied to Novak's operation, and arrests were made. The scale of Novak's criminal activities shocked the city, and the backlash from the public was immediate. Novak, however, didn't go down without a fight. His people retaliated with force, sending waves of intimidation and threats to anyone connected to the investigation. It was clear that he wasn't going to give up his power without a fight. But it didn't matter. The walls were closing in on him, and the truth was too powerful to ignore. The evidence James and Marcus had gathered, along with the help of the brave officers and journalists who had picked up the story, was enough to bring Novak to his knees. As the authorities closed in on Novak's final hideout, James and Marcus watched from a distance, knowing that their part in this fight was over. They had given everything to expose the truth, and now the justice system would do its job. The final moment came quickly. Novak, cornered and desperate, tried to flee, but it was too late. The police had surrounded him. As he was taken into custody, his empire crumbled beneath him. The connections he had so carefully built were severed, and his influence over the city vanished. Weeks later, as the city began to heal, James sat alone in a quiet cafe, sipping his coffee. The adrenaline had long since worn off, and the weight of the past few months began to feel like a distant memory. The city was beginning to feel safe again. The shadow that had loomed over it for so long finally lifted. Marcus joined him at the table, a rare moment of peace between them. They had done what they set out to do. They had taken down one of the most dangerous men in the city, and the weight that had hung over them was finally gone. "Do you think it's over?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet, reflective. James glanced out the window, watching the world go by.
For now.
Novak's empire is finished, but I know there will always be more like him. People who thrive in the shadows, who think they can control everything. But we've shown that even the darkest corners can be exposed. The fight doesn't end here. It just changes. Marcus nodded.
Yeah.
But this time we won. James smiled, his heart finally feeling a little lighter. This time we did. And with that, they both knew that while the battle had been hard, they had won not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been under Novak's thumb. The city could finally breathe again. The sun set over the skyline, casting a warm glow over the streets. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long while, James felt like he could finally let go. For now, at least, they were free. And so, the man who had been targeted for his power, his influence, had taken down the very forces that sought to control him. But James knew that freedom was never guaranteed, and that there would always be new battles to fight. For now, though, he had won the most important one.